Joining us right now from the White House, U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being with us today. Some big news yesterday with the ECB. Let's talk a little bit about where we stand, because going back to May, you said that the trade war with China was on hold and that lasted a few weeks. Is this a different situation? Is this a more formalized or more concrete situation with the ECB this time around?
Well, good morning. First of all, it's great to be here with you. And I think this is. We had a long negotiating session yesterday. We concluded an outline of an agreement, and now we'll turn this into a real agreement. But this really started with President Trump and his discussions at the G7, making it clear that he wanted, with the G7 in Europe, free trade, which was no tariffs, no tariff barriers, no subsidies. I continued those conversations last weekend at the G20 with my counterparts. We also discussed very significant WTO reform, which we'll call WTO 2.0. We had a long negotiation session yesterday, concluding with an outline of an agreement.
That's great news to hear, and I should correct myself, the EU. We just had the ECB holding rates firm, and so we've been talking a lot about that, but obviously this is all with the EU. What does this mean? We're still trying to get the details on things. We've heard from the EU that this is a situation where the auto tariffs, the threatened auto tariffs, will be put on hold while these negotiations take place. Is that the case?
That's correct. So the first issue that we'll immediately begin negotiating is to resolve the issues on the steel and aluminum tariffs and the retaliatory tariffs. So phase one will be to immediately resolve those issues so that there'll be no tariffs in either direction on that. President Trump has said that as long as we're negotiating the overall agreement, that there will be no new tariffs in either direction.
And in terms of resolving the steel and aluminum tariffs, is that a heavy lift at this point, or do you think you have the groundwork laid to be able to remove those tariffs as well?
I think we have the groundwork laid, and I'd hope we'll resolve that very quickly.
That's great news to hear. Secretary Mnuchin, just last week we heard from Larry Kudlow, and I know the news cycle is changing so rapidly. We hear so many things going on. But Larry Kudlow told us that when it comes to China, we're at a bit of a standstill, that it didn't look like the Chinese necessarily wanted to negotiate. Is that the situation still today when it comes to China?
Well, I'm not going to go into the specifics. We are having some conversations, and I've made perfectly clear that any time China is willing to seriously negotiate, and we're talking about a commitment to reduce the bilateral trade deficit, as well as to deal with technology issues, forced joint ventures, we're available anytime. So there continue to be some quiet conversations, but we're prepared if they're going to make serious moves to negotiate. Is
it fair to say the ball's in their court at this point?
I'm not going to comment whose court it's in and get into that level of detail. I would just say that, again, we're very focused with the EU. We're very happy about those discussions. Last week, I was in Mexico. I had the opportunity to meet with the new president-elect and his full economic team. I think we have a very strong direction to move forward with NAFTA, and we hope that we'll conclude those negotiations. Ambassador Lighthizer is very focused on that. So I think we're well on our way to resolving a lot of these trade issues. And as we've said, the economic plan has always been tax reform, regulatory relief, and trade.
With trade, again, going back to just NAFTA and Mexico and these conversations that are taking place, both Mexico and Canada have said that they want this to remain a three-country deal. Is that the position of the United States? It sounds like you're moving towards that direction for sure.
President Trump has said he's focused on the deal and making sure we resolve the issues, and whether it's one deal or two deals, as long as we get the right agreement, we're indifferent.
What are the standing points or the sticking points that still exist with NAFTA? For a long time, it had been a country of origin, and then in particular, some of the auto parts situations. Is that still?
I think the good news is Ambassador Lighthizer has worked very hard. He's closed many chapters of the agreement. I think, as you know, these are very complicated issues that go over a large area, and I think the negotiating team is very focused on the remaining points. So I'm not going to go into the specifics, but a lot of the work is done, and we're hopeful that we'll have an agreement in principle in the near future.
Mr. Secretary, just want to get your thoughts about the idea of subsidizing farmers and whether ultimately that could lead to handouts, or I imagine a line out the door of the White House behind you for subsidies in all sorts of industries, and how you think about that.
Well, let me be very clear. These are not subsidies, and we're not interested in subsidies. What we are interested that to the extent that China and other people attack our farmers specifically in an unfair way, an unfair retaliation, we will defend our farmers. And I think you saw yesterday a major part of the EU agreement was agriculture. We'll immediately focus on soybeans, but we're going to focus on other issues. We want to make sure that our farmers have fair opportunity to compete throughout the world.
Mr. Secretary, this agreement now that we have with the EU, it seems, is kind of an agreement to continue talking, to work towards some kind of solution, maybe meet in the middle on many of these issues. Is there any way to suggest that perhaps negotiations with China might come to a similar point? I mean, it doesn't necessarily seem as if anything agreed to yesterday with the EU is going to move the needle dramatically on our trade deficit, for example, in the near term. So I wonder if there's a way to extrapolate how we might approach things with China.
Well, I do think you're going to see movement in the trade deficit over the next year with the EU. Again, this is $1 trillion trading bloc. This is an enormous opportunity. We have about $100 billion in trade deficit with them in goods and services. There's enormous opportunities. As we said yesterday, we're focused across a lot of different areas. LNG, where they're building terminals, chemicals, industrials, medical devices. We agreed to try to limit regulations, the medical device industry and pharmaceuticals, very big opportunity. So I think you're going to see a lot of progress over the next year on this.
Secretary Mnuchin, I know that the tariffs that are collected are actually collected by the Treasury Department that go into the general budget, I guess. Could you give us an idea of how much we've collected to this point in the tariffs that have been put on?
Again, we're early in the stages, so I'm not going to give specific numbers. We do collect them in the general fund. But again, our long-term objective is not to collect tariffs. Our long-term objective is to have free and fair and reciprocal trade. And anywhere we can do that, we are the largest trading area where we have free opportunities to trade. And we just want fair and reciprocal trade in all areas. And that's what we're focused on.
Mr. Secretary, a political question. There are obviously a number of American companies that have been impacted by the potential for a trade war, aluminum and such. I'm thinking of a company called Mid-Continental, which deals with nails. And I was reading a Washington Post article where you had the operations manager saying, we're in a situation where we're fighting against our own country. It seems like a battle that we shouldn't have to fight. This is a Trump supporter, by the way, said there's a lot of good things that he's doing, but he's affecting me now, and I don't appreciate it. What do you tell people like that?
Well, I think most people understand what President Trump is doing, and what we're doing is good for the economy. I think, as you know, we're looking forward to a very strong GDP number. We have real economic growth. And we have a large group of people between Commerce and USTR and Treasury that looks at all these individual situations. We have a process to grant exemptions to the extent that people can't get U.S. products. We have a process to manage through the transition. So this is something we're very carefully looking at, and we're sympathetic that our counterparties have targeted specific areas of the economy on a very political basis, which I think is unfair. But we're not going to stand down. We're going to fight for free trade and opportunities for American workers and American companies.
Mr. Secretary, what you're saying is music to the market's ears. They've been wanting to hear a message like this, and the idea that you're hopeful that progress will be made in the near future, I'm sure, is something that's helping free traders right now in the markets. In terms of where you expect to be, let's just say, at the beginning of 2019, fair to say that you think we will have agreements in place for NAFTA, that we will have an agreement in place for the EU, and maybe things will be progressing with China?
Again, I'm not going to comment on China, but my hope is that they come to the table and that they negotiate serious issues on market access. But I would say on NAFTA, we hope to have an agreement in principle clearly very soon. That's the first priority. The EU, I think you're going to see pieces of this roll out. So it's not going to be just one major agreement. It will be pieces that we agree over time. And I think we're making a lot of progress. And I would also, again, just repeat, WTO 2.0, that's a big deal. Reforming the WTO system, President Trump never said he wanted to get out of it. What he said is he wants to fix it. Another old agreement that needs to be updated so that it's fair for us and fair for the EU and our other G20 counterparts.
What would be an example or two of the fixes to the WTO? What do you think would make it a better and stronger partnership?
Well, I think there's a lot of issues. I don't want to go through them all today because, again, we're going to start negotiating them. But I think it's really about reciprocal and fair trade. So what we've said all along is President Trump believes in reciprocal tariffs, reciprocal fair trade. We'll drop to zero if other people drop to zero. And it's not just tariffs. You have to focus on, in many cases, the non-tariff barriers, the subsidies, the issues with state-owned enterprises. Those are all even more important than the tariffs per se. So it has to be an entire agreement.
To that end, Mr. Secretary, wanted to get your thoughts about Qualcomm terminating that proposal to buy NXP, in large part because China would not grant it regulatory approval. This is another form of a tariff in some cases. What do you make of that?
Well, I'm very disappointed that they didn't get regulatory approval. I specifically had conversations. Unfortunately, I think this is another example of where it was approved in every single other territory. We're just looking for U.S. companies to be treated fairly. And I'm sure Qualcomm will continue on a great path. It's a great American company. But I think it's unfortunate that that didn't get approved after what was a long 2-year process.
The next time a Chinese company wants to buy an American company, is CFIUS going to look into it a little bit more? I mean, how do you see this sort of back and forth going?
No, we're not going to approach this in any way on an unfair basis. Every single one of these cases we review fairly. We look at for national security. We couldn't be happier that the CFIUS reform just passed. Again, this wasn't targeted at China or any one country. President Trump was very clear. We want a level playing field. That's our job at Treasury, and that's what we're going to do.
You don't think that this was a retaliation by China?
I'm not going to comment on why they made the decision. I don't know why they made the decision. I just commented that I was disappointed in the decision. And
let me just ask one other trade-related question, because you probably saw the president's tweets last week related to the EU fine on Google. Do you think that's a trade issue?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily a trade issue, but what I would say it's an economic issue, and I can tell you, we have major tax issues that we are defending our internet companies against unfair taxes. It's a discussion every time I'm with my counterparts at the G7 and the G20. We want to resolve these issues.
Mr. Secretary, just in terms of some of those tweets, the president also made clear that he doesn't appreciate seeing the dollar rise because he thinks other countries are manipulating either their currency and or their exchange rates. I realize you have to be careful what you say about the dollar and the policy there, but we have seen the dollar under a little pressure after the Bank of Japan seemed to indicate that it might be willing to soak up some of the liquidity. Now, we have to hear a little bit more about this, but obviously all of these issues play into the strength of the dollar. We've seen treasuries pick up, the yield in the 10-year almost hitting 3%, and the 2-year picking up substantially, too. Do you think these moves are being made, that the market's right to assess these moves the way they're being made by just watching central bank policy and these things going through? Does it make sense to you from your viewpoint?
Well, I'm not going to comment on where the dollar is in the short term, as I've said in the past. But what I will say, and I've said over the last week, we are obviously closely monitoring the Chinese RMB and the weakening in that market, which is either intervention or an absence of them on capital flows and other issues. We're going to carefully review that as part of currency manipulation. And we're looking at other currencies. And again, we've always said the long-term strength of the dollar is important. It's a result of a very strong U.S. economy. But we will carefully monitor, as we do at Treasury, currency manipulation across lots of different markets and make sure that people don't use currencies for unfair trade advantages.
Now, Mr. Secretary, a regulatory question, given the big headline of the morning, Facebook. And wanted just to ask you, if you looked at their earnings yesterday, they blamed GDPR from the European Union as at least a part of that, along with trying to increase its privacy tools. Do you blame Europe? And do you think that some of the regulatory measures that have taken place in Europe should happen here with Facebook?
Well, I think there are some legitimate privacy issues that need to be addressed, and you see that here. But I think Europe has gone too far And again, this is another area of we want to make sure that our countries aren't unfairly attacked for regulations. And data localization is something that we're fighting for. We believe that data should be treated and protected. That's very important for U.S. consumers and U.S. people and everyone else. But we want to make sure that it's done in a fair way and not attacking U.S. companies.
Secretary Mnuchin, I want to thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate it, and love to hear updates on trade as you can tell us more.
Great. Thank you. Good to be here with you.
Hey there, thanks for checking out CNBC on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all of the day's biggest stories. You can also click on any of the videos around me to watch the latest from CNBC. Thanks for watching.